Hi, everybody. Connie, thank you very much for that nice introduction. Roger and Neil, it's a pleasure to be here with both of you today. Barbara, thank you for everything that you have done to help create this mechanism for us to come together and to honor a really wonderful person. It's a treat for me to have met some of the family of Jim Mahoney, and to have them with us here today, I think speaks for how close-knit that family is, how proud they are of the legacy that Jim Mahoney represents. But it's wonderful for us to stay connected with that family because we all think so very highly of Jim Mahoney. We are here to honor the man, but also his legacy, and to reflect on how what he did is actually very relevant today, and how how he did things and how he conceptualized the world really presents some role models for all of us. The topic of my remarks today is science in a post-truth world. And I see this through the lens of a scientist, but reflecting on what's happening in society today. And I chose this topic in part because I think it is not only topical, it must be on the minds of most of you in this room, and it provides an opportunity for us to collectively reflect on what our obligations as scientists are, how science is related to society, dependent on society, helping to benefit society. And those were topics that I think were near and dear to Jim's heart. That's really what he spent a lot of his life doing, is thinking about society, science and society. Before I launch into my specific remarks, I just want to take stock of who all is here. I know many of you, and in fact, it's great to see some old friends, folks I haven't seen for a while, such a treat. But how many of you here are from NOAA? Just a show of hands. Okay, quite a few folks. Thank you guys for coming. I know your lives are really, really busy. How many AMS folks do we have here? Okay, terrific. And how many academics are in the audience? Okay. How many government folks, NOAA or otherwise? Government folks? Okay, great. Industry, business and industry? Excellent, terrific. Okay. So this partnership between AMS and NOAA in creating this lectureship is really the kind of partnership that we need. We need more of these connectors between different segments of society coming together to make good things happen. And I appreciate Neil's talking about that, shining a spotlight on it, and I think that that, in fact, is very, very important. Turning to the topic of science in a post-truth world, I really chose this in part because the rich legacy that Jim left as a scientist, as an academic, as a business entrepreneur, a government leader, and a role model was a real nice integration of things that are important to connect science to society. And as most of you know, he, in addition to having multiple distinguished careers, really navigated two emerging issues that were rife with tension, rife with political tension, and produced outcomes that were both true to the science and politically feasible. That's not an easy thing to do. And he, in both of those arenas, showed that it is possible and showed possible ways for achieving that endpoint. How to get good science into policy, how to organize interdisciplinary efforts, how to have interagency collaboration and cooperation. And his connecting science to policy, but also these interdisciplinary approaches, while always respecting scientific integrity, I think are hallmarks of his legacy that are super relevant today. In my remarks, I'm going to try to leave you with the following three thoughts. One is that there are unprecedented threats to science today, but that we also have unparalleled opportunities. And how we deal with those threats and whether we take advantage of those opportunities is a function of what scientists do. Those of you in this room, scientists in academia, scientists in industry, scientists in government agencies, scientists in NGOs as well. Those scientists have an amazing opportunity, but they also have, I think, more responsibility and more opportunity than many of them realize. I'm going to talk a little bit to frame the issue in terms of what I see as a science and society paradox, focus on how people have already responded to that paradox, and then end with what I see as opportunities for where we can go from here. Here's the paradox. At the very time that science is so important to people's lives, it is relevant, it is helpful, it is making things possible that never were, we see a widening gap between science and society. Now you will note that the date of this cartoon that was in the Boston Globe is 2012. The cartoon wasn't animated, I animated it, but this is not a new topic. This has been a topic that has been underway for some time. Many people have thought about, okay, what does this disconnect mean? How do we address it? And in fact, when I was the president of AAAS, the topic of my presidential address in 1998 for the society was entering the century of the environment, the need for a new social contract with science. And what I said at the time was simply that so much of the knowledge that scientists have is locked away in journals, is shared in professional scientific meetings, but is not necessarily getting to the public, to policymakers, to leaders in industry, to civil society more broadly. And that we no longer had the luxury of time to expect that stuff in the peer-reviewed literature would eventually work its way into public consciousness. And that it was actually the responsibility of scientists to share what they knew in a more active way with the people that were making that science possible, with society more broadly. And that we needed to be a lot more active in communicating science in ways that were relevant, understandable, credible, and useful to society. And that was sort of a rethinking of our social contract. It was not enough to simply discover new knowledge, to advance the frontiers of science. We had to go beyond that. We couldn't just discover and publish. We had to share as well. And that sharing needed to be done in ways that demonstrated true humility and transparency. It wasn't just, here's what you want to know, take my word for it, and I'm up here on this pedestal and I'm going to tell you the truth. It needed to be more humble, more honest, more transparent in terms of what we know, what we don't know. That, I would suggest, was not the beginning of a conversation. Other people had been talking about it, but it really crystallized in a lot of people's minds some of the opportunities for science. And I think in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, we saw an innovation within the scientific community more broadly, not just here in the United States, but abroad, that was really, from an academic standpoint, sort of getting out of the ivory tower and realizing that there are opportunities for us to connect with the world. Government agencies had been doing this for some time, and I'll talk about them in a minute, but this initial thinking of mine was very much focused on the academic world. So I would characterize this from ivory tower to a social contract. from just doing science to also sharing it more broadly. And so the focus at that time was on science communication. It was on getting information out. Following that, we've seen the emergence of a number of new organizations that are designed to help scientists learn how to do what I call be bilingual, be able to speak the language of science, but also speak the language of lay people. And the Leopold Leadership Program that I co-founded, Compass that I co-founded, and Climate Central that I co-founded are all variations on this theme of helping scientists who really want to and have potential to be great communicators figure out how to do it, how to be more effective and have the networks and the support to actually do it. The AAAS now has a fantastic program, the Center for Public Engagement with Science and Technology, the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science takes a really interesting approach using improv to do some of the same things. So now we see a variety of opportunities that exist. And I would suggest that these are fantastic, but they're not enough. And one of the things that I saw at NOAA and was told by many of the scientists at NOAA is that we don't have all the opportunities we want to have the kind of training that we think we need to be more effective. And so there is an opportunity. So those programs, I think, have been underway. I think we've seen a real transformation in the appetite of scientists for being more public. At the same time, I think that many people were really stunned, caught off guard, and very surprised with the emergence of a populist global movement that has risen much more quickly than I think people thought was happening and took everybody by surprise. And in fact, in 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary identified post-truth as the word of the year for 2016. And the suggestion is that, for many of us, for decades and decades, science was seen as really essential to our future. It was a trusted source of knowledge. It was a key to conquering diseases or winning the space race, an engine of economic growth. And this belief in the importance of science has recently been swamped by this emergence of this post-truth world. You will note that OED defined post-truth, and I just want to read the definition, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Just a few days ago, Ted Koppel, in speaking at Stanford, said, in his view, fake news, alternative facts, post-truth politics are, quote, corrosive to the very foundations of a vibrant democracy. And so this is seen by a number of people as a challenge to things that we have held near and dear, the importance of evidence, the importance of information, and presents a real challenge to society more broadly and to science more specifically. The emergence of this post-truth world galvanized scientists like I have never seen before. We saw immediate responses that were to demonstrate, to march, to defend science. And there were marches last year and this year, science marches. These are some of the signs, symbols that of incredible variety and creativity. And this focus on science was not just scientists marching, but a lot of citizens marching as well. And I think that that's really an important note. It's also important to note that this was a global phenomenon. This is not just a US phenomenon. There were all these locations around the world for last year's science marches. So this really is a global phenomenon. Even Antarctica, there were marches and signs that were present. So the responses by scientists, researchers, and educators was to demonstrate and to defend science. But it was more than that. I have personally seen a lot of scientists that never did anything other than stay in their little lanes, contact their members of Congress for the first time, donating to organizations that were standing up for science, writing op-eds or letters to the editor, returning calls from journalists, imagine, talking to or embracing social media. So there's been a lot of this, and in fact, I gave a talk last year at the annual meeting of the National Academy of Sciences. So these are some of the highly recognized scientists in the country, many of them quite distinguished scientists. And I asked them how many of them had done one or more of these things in the last year. So this was last spring. And probably 2/3 of the hands in the room went up, which just astounded me. And I said, how many of you did one of these things 5 years ago? Most of the hands went down. It was just a smattering. So the point here is that scientists have been really galvanized to stand up for science. I believe, though, that this is just part of the answer. This is defending and resisting. And I think we need offense, not just defense. Not that defense is unimportant, but that it's only part of the strategy. And everybody knows in any kind of sports that you really need both. I reflected on some of these challenges, and a little more than a year ago wrote an editorial in the Frontiers in Ecology and Environment journal. And then later, just about a year ago now, gave a talk when I received the Public Welfare Medal from the National Academy of Sciences, focusing on this theme of science in a post-truth world. And what I would like to do is share with you some of the things that I was suggesting then, and I'm going to update with current sort of how my thinking on this has evolved. So the question is, how can we resolve this science-society paradox and address a post-truth mentality? First and foremost, I think we need to listen. That's one of the most important lessons in communication. You need to understand. You don't just start doing stuff. Defense is a reaction, but to have a very savvy, smart, effective offense, you need to understand what the landscape is, what the issues are, what the players are. So first and foremost, scientists need to understand, and then address the reasons why this post-truth world has emerged. Those are complex. They're very complex, and I don't pretend to have the expertise to fully understand all of what's out there. But I'd like to share sort of two categories, what I think are contributing factors on the societal side, and then in a minute I'll talk about contributing factors on the science side. There's been a lot written and said about how important the increased inequities are in this country and around the world in laying the groundwork for a post-truth society. Economic as well as opportunity inequities. Those are very real. There are also very powerful vested interests that are promulgating a very self-serving set of messages, an anti-science agenda, and we can't deny that those are there and ignore that they exist. We also, though, have other things happening in society. People can now choose where they get their news. When I was growing up, everybody got their news from the newspapers, or if you had a newspaper that wasn't actually all that good, which was the case in Denver, we got our news from the TV. Every night on the evening news, and there were 3 channels, and they all pretty much had the same news. So you chose whether you're going to watch A, B, or C, depending on which personalities you like. But it was pretty much the same kind of information. That is not the case today. We all choose the kinds of information that we choose, and a lot of people choose sources that are going to confirm their biases about how the world works and what's important. And so that landscape makes it a lot more complicated, and that is part of the challenge here. In addition to those societal contributing factors, I think there are contributing factors in the science society world that are relevant to this conversation. One is that the perceptions that citizens have of scientists is quite interesting to explore and sample. Many people don't trust molecular biologists. They think that they just play God. So that's a problem. If some kind of science is seen as having some kind of ulterior motives. Other kinds of science, and environmental science is often criticized for always being doom and gloom. There's nothing good. It's always bad. It's getting worse and worse and blah, blah, blah. And people just kind of tune out and say, okay, I've had enough of this. I don't want it anymore. I'm not going to listen to you. So those are perceptions that are out there that we need to be aware of. Not that they apply across the board to all of society or to all of science, but there are perceptions of different types of science. Fortunately, social scientists have done a lot to think about and understand the perceptions that people have of science and ways in which scientific communications can be made more effective, ways in which engagement of scientists with society can be more effective. This is just a handful of reports from the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council around this topic, but there's a lot more richness. And I want to pull out a few of the findings that I think are relevant from not just these reports, but from others as well. And I'm going to start with this one. Most Americans cannot name a living scientist. That's stunning. That's incredible. Scientists think, well, of course, all of my friends and colleagues know I'm a scientist, but when asked to name someone, they say, Einstein? And then they think, oh no, he's probably dead. And then, a name, the 30% that could name one person, who do you think that was? Who was the person that most people would come up with? The number one person was Stephen Hawking, which is unfortunate because people can no longer name him, but he did leave his legacy and he was well known. Bill Nye, yes. Neil deGrasse Tyson, yes, are ones that some people will name. Jane Goodall is another. So there's just a few that are out there. So here's an incredible opportunity. We need more scientists being seen as scientists by the public, okay? In addition to that, social scientists have looked at what is it about a scientist or anybody, what is it about someone that makes them be seen as being trustworthy. And this is research by Fisk and Dupree, and they have concluded that in fact there are two axes that are important to understand. One is the axis of warmth. How warm does someone seem to the audience? And the second is an axis of competence. How much do they know what they're talking about? And what these social scientists found was that for somebody to be seen as trustworthy, they had to be both competent and warm. It was not enough for them to be seen as just competent. They had to also be warm to be trustworthy. So you can see here, professors, researchers, scientists in general are seen as being highly competent, but not so much on the warmth side. Scientists are often competent but cold. So that is something that's in our power to change. And part of that is a communication style. Part of it is the way scientists are trained to talk to people. Don't tell stories, stick to the facts, blah, blah, blah. You know, start with all the evidence, and then finally, when everybody's sound asleep, get to the point. So a lot of the things that are sort of the way the culture of science has evolved don't help us be seen by the public as trustworthy, because we don't not seen as being warm. Now that doesn't mean you cannot be warm and competent, but I think those are some interesting lessons to be learned. There's no doubt about the fact that for some issues, there is a gap between where the scientific community is and where the public is. That's true on topics like evolution, vaccines, climate change. And it's important to just understand that's the lay of the land. It's also useful to know that the public is not all one monolithic uniform thing. This is a figure from some of Tony Lyserowicz's work at the Yale program on climate communication. And what they found was that, in fact, there are a whole series of different publics that are out there. And this is what their analyses show as of March of 2016, that 17% of the American public are alarmed about climate change, 28 are concerned, 27 cautious, 7 disengaged, don't care, not listening, 11% are doubtful, and only 10% are outright dismissive. So understanding that lay of the land is actually really helpful in thinking about how to communicate on topic as challenging as climate change. We've also learned through the years about what kind of ways to communicate work for science. Teeing off Dupree and Fisk's work, being warm, being personal is useful. Telling stories. Social scientists tell us that stories are sticky. People remember them. And that's why all of our elected representatives tell stories. People remember them. They can encapsulate something. So that is a useful communication tool. The 3 thys. Know thyself. So know what you know and what you don't know. And your style. Know thy audience. So every audience is not in the same place. Understand what your audience is, where they're coming from, how much they know, so that when you are connecting with them, you can do so in a way that tees off what they know, fill in what they don't know, listen to ideas they have, incorporate them, etc. But know thy stuff as well. And don't get caught up in being an expert on everything that you aren't. I just can't tell you how many Nobel laureates I know that once they have that imprimatur, think they're an expert on everything and start spouting off on everything. And in fact, they shouldn't be. So, know what you know and what you don't know. One of the biggest challenges I find, and one of the most powerful things to do, is to find good analogies and good metaphors to connect the dots for people between something they know well and something they don't know at all and is very confusing. And if you can connect those dots through analogies and metaphor, that can really break through and say, oh, okay, now I get it. Finding common ground with your audience, not just starting with the facts and assertions about what is the answer, but finding common ground and creating a shared value experience enables you to then pursue things that might be particularly contentious. So this is just a quick summary of some of the things that are communication tips that have evolved through time. Another one is to simply simplify your messages. Scientists tend to just blah, 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 too much complication. So keep it simple. But also tailor your messages to a specific audience in terms of what they're interested in, what they know, what they care about. And finally, A good tool that a lot of people have discovered is the message box that was developed by and used by Compass, which is, if you're interested in that and don't know about it, you can find it on the Compass website, compassscicom.org. That blue doesn't come through very well, and I couldn't change it because it's one of these URLs, and it's just a default color, so sorry about that. Okay, so against the backdrop of this, there is a new report that is just out from the American Academy of Arts and Sciences about public perceptions of science in America that has a lot of interesting findings. It's easy to assume that science is really in trouble and everything's bad, but in fact, this report, I think, has a lot of reassuring things that enable us to be smarter about how we're talking about these issues. I'm going to highlight just a few findings from their report. Number one, confidence in scientific leaders has remained relatively stable over this period of time from 1973 to the present. This shows you the percentage of US adults that have a great deal of confidence in the leaders of, let's start with Congress, the press, and banks. So that's purple, yellow, and green. These have all gone down through time. People have lost confidence in that leadership. Military, the blue, kind of teal color, has risen through time. People have more confidence than they used to in military leaders. Science during this time, orange, has remained pretty steady. So that's actually very useful information. It's very powerful. People still, by and large, have confidence in scientific leaders. A majority of Americans view scientific research as beneficial. So this is starting in 1985 through the present, and this is the percentage of people who say that, in the blue, benefits of scientific research outweigh the harm, potential harm. So that's remained pretty constant. That's also really encouraging, and that's pretty high. 70% say the benefits outweigh the potential harm. These are the responses for benefits and are about equal to harm. Harm is greater than benefit, and don't know are those three categories, just in case you can't read them. So taking that into account, the question is, how can we resolve this science-society paradox and address the post-truth mentality? And what I just covered was sort of understanding where we are, but what some of the challenges are. I'm going to pivot now to suggesting that to address those, respond to those challenges that are out there, we can't just stay in our ivory towers in academia or halls of federal agencies in Washington, D.C., or wherever you are. We need to be more integrated into society, physically and psychologically integrated. In other words, scientists need to engage more and more effectively with society. Okay, that's all well and good. How do we do that? What does that mean? Well, first and foremost, I would suggest that we need to demonstrate to people the value of science, not just assert. It's not just trust me, but actually show them and demonstrate that it is. This is a lot easier to do with weather forecasting, for example, than some of the other things. But we also need to provide hope. We need to not just have everything focus on all the bad, but actually be a little more balanced, and to understand what are the impediments within the scientific reward, within the cultures of academia, the cultures of agencies, and what is it that we're training our people to do. So let's dig into those a little bit more. Demonstrate, not just assert the value of science. Well, a lot of the challenge here is in the entitlement rhetoric that I often hear from academics or from government people. I'm from the government, I'm here to help kind of thing, but also trust me, we've done the research on this. And instead of just asserting that something is the way it is, we need to actually demonstrate it. Make science more accessible, show its merits, and engage citizens. And the opportunities to engage citizens is a very, very powerful one. Whether it is citizen science around weather, whether it is fishery cooperative programs to get data on abundance of fish stocks, to do fishery management plans, whatever it is, engaging scientists in that is very, very powerful. In so doing, we can create trust. You can develop shared values and shared experiences that then can be built on that, and show people that in fact who scientists are, that they're actually warm, caring people, and then have science be seen as trusted, as opposed to countering the narrative, the assertions that are often out there that science is wasteful, it's imperious, it's threatening, it's doom and gloom, etc. These are not new practices for many of you in this room. This is not something that is totally foreign. This is something that is easier for some types of science than others. But I think it's worth taking stock of, can we do a better job of this, and what are the lessons learned that we can pass on to other communities? The second way that we can do this is to provide hope. And that is simply to identify and share successes that are out there. Let's replicate and scale them. So instead of always sort of asking for more money for this program, talk about the successes and have those successes really be broadly recognized and broadly publicized. Find those successes, replicate them, and scale them. And the opportunity to focus on what is driving a particular behavior. How do we change the incentives so that people can be incentivized to do the right thing is useful. And then creating solutions. And part of this will require teaming up with others, whether it's civil society or businesses that have complementary skills and goals. I think is a real opportunity. Part of the framing for discussions about science harken back to the dichotomy that's in a lot of people's minds between basic research and applied research. And Donald Stokes in 1999, wrote in his book, Pasteur's Quadrant, actually it's 97, I see here, that in fact, that framing doesn't really capture much of the richness of the science that we do. Basic science is research that has low consideration of use, but is high just in the quest for fundamental understanding. How does the world work? Applied science is often seen as high consideration of use, but making very little contribution to the advancements of knowledge. And Donald Stokes says, hey folks, there's actually a third category, which he calls use-inspired science, which is fundamental research that is making advances in fundamental knowledge, but is also immediately relevant to society. And I would suggest that in fact, this is a very rich area for which we need a lot more action, a lot more funding. Not that basic science is unimportant. It's incredibly important because we don't know where the next frontiers are going to be. But we need a lot more, in my view, use-inspired science. One of the projects that I've been involved in has been pushing the boundaries of science in the ocean to better understand how much of the ocean do we need to protect? What kind of protection? How much of the ocean? How big should protected areas be? How compatible are they with other uses? How do we, how far apart should they be? Those kinds of things. So that's just a very quick example of use-inspired science. Providing hope, I was really encouraged and heartened to see the Earth Optimism Summit that was created initially last year by the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, Nancy Knowlton, the Sant Ocean Chair, at the Smithsonian Institution, took the lead on this, Over 250 scientists from 24 countries came together to share the good news stories that were very powerful, and most people had never heard of them. You hear about the doom and gloom, but you don't read about the amazing stuff that's going on. They took the next step this year was to have a digital event to do the same thing. And so this is really moving beyond doom and gloom and providing hope for people in the planet focused on oceans. So we've seen two kind of pivots within the scientific community, one in the 90s and the 2000s, from just doing science to more emphasis on sharing, and more recently from just communication to actual engagement with society, which is a very different thing, and partnerships. Also from just basic science to basic plus use-inspired science, which is called translational science by the biomedical community, so that's the same idea. And also from just diagnosing problems to crafting solutions. So the scientific community is responding to a lot of the new needs that are emerging from society. And I would suggest that this is very encouraging, but that it's not yet at the scale that's needed. We don't have enough people doing these. And I think it's useful to think about another nod to social sciences, Everett Rogers' model that talks about diffusion of innovation. Whether innovation is an idea or a new technology, he was saying, what are the steps that it takes for something to be created and then eventually go viral? And he suggests that there is this bell-shaped curve where you have early innovators creating some idea, early adopters sort of taking it up, majority adopters bring it to a point. There are late majority and there are laggards, some of which will never come on board. But the question is, how do you take something and have it actually go viral so that it's self-sustaining? How do you reach the critical mass? And so these early innovators, early adopters is what we see going on in this space now that I've been talking about. How do we actually have these innovations reach critical mass and have a much greater influence on public perceptions of the value, the importance of science, and what it means to them in a very personal sense. So some of the impediments to achieving the things that I'm talking about are the cultures within the academic world, the cultures within government world, and that means partly the reward system, partly the expectations, what are the job descriptions for people. Oftentimes in agencies across the board, scientists are rewarded for being good administrators, not for being good scientists, okay? That's a problem. We need to have good scientists, but we also need them out engaging with the world, not just managing programs. In the academic community, when you come up for promotion and tenure, you are rewarded for grants, publications, and good teaching. You're not rewarded for doing engagement, even though it takes time. So those are cultural challenges that are preventing some of this from happening. Some of the other impediments are the training that can unleash the younger generations who want to be doing more of this engagement, more of the use-inspired science, but aren't quite sure how to do it. And also the infrastructure for partnerships, because partnering with business, partnering with civil society, partnerships between professional scientific societies and government agencies have a whole world of possibilities that we haven't yet tapped. So modifying the reward structures so that we can actually remove those impediments is, I think, a key next step. So we want to have, if we believe engagement is important, we have to have that be part of the expectation for what people will do, and they have to be recognized and rewarded for doing it. Students need to be encouraged, enabled, and trained to engage effectively. And we have to recognize that doing that takes time, and you can't expect people to excel at everything. Now, I want to make it clear that I don't think all scientists should be engaging, for example. Some of them probably shouldn't. But I would assert that they should all support those who do, their colleagues who do. So I've talked about the science-society paradox, some of the responses of scientists sort of on the defense, emerging reactions that are going on the offense, and the emerging opportunities I've touched on. And the real opportunities are to do a better job of embedding science in society. We need to infuse a lot more science into social media. We need to enhance the opportunities and effectiveness for citizen science. We need to team up with communities to solve their problems that they have identified, so this is science in service to them. Make science a lot more visible and relevant. And a lot of opportunities now are emerging for scientists to run for office. So these are all more on the offense. And the Political Action Group 314 Action has just recently announced that there are actually 450 scientists that are running for local, state, and federal offices, 25 of them at the federal level. So that's pretty amazing, and is sort of, I think, a reflection of the interest of the scientific community in being part of the solution, not just part of the problem. So this will require new innovations, confronting the cultural barriers that I've talked about, providing new incentives for the actions that I've described, providing the kind of training and mentoring, training not just in communications, but how do you engage effectively? How do you do conflict resolution, negotiation, system thinking, teamwork are all things that are going to enable scientists to be more effective with this engagement. And then creating the networks and the partnerships and the funding to enable that to happen. Creating a new community of practitioners that are actively in connecting science to the public, to society. And that will entail opportunities to trade best practices and share ideas. So we've seen some innovations from the ivory tower to the social contract, and now I think we're seeing another innovation from social contract to science embedded in and serving society, maybe. So in my view, a strong offense means serving society better, engaging more effectively, co-creating knowledge with citizens, providing hope, focusing on solutions, removing the cultural barriers so that those things can happen, and improving training and engagement. So my message, I'll end with where I started. Science is indeed facing some major challenges. Maybe it's not quite as bad as we might have thought, but we have unparalleled opportunities to serve society better. And this is only going to happen if scientists really take the bull by the horns and step up and make things happen. And I'd like to think that we can do this in a way that is inspired by Jim's example in confronting challenging times and figuring out how to navigate those. And I would suggest that maybe if he were here, he would say, it's time for us to take back the narrative. It's time to write a new chapter in the relationship between science and society, and for us collectively to have a quantum leap in relevance. And the question is, will you join me in doing that? Thank you.